Welcome to Audiobook 365 Stories.
The sun was setting. Its soft light came through the window and shone on a pale face resting on the pillow. It looked as if a golden light from heaven had touched her. Two people sat beside the bed. One was a 14-year-old girl named Helen. She was tall for her age, with gray-green eyes and short, curly dark hair. The other was a middle-aged woman named Woods. She had taken care of Helen since she was a baby. She was part friend and part servant to Helen's mother. Mrs. Ashe had been quiet all day. 1 year ago, her husband had brought her to California because she was very sick. He hoped the warm air would make her better. At first, she seemed stronger, but then her husband suddenly became sick and died. After that, her illness became worse. She was too weak to fight it. She wanted to live for Helen, but she knew she was dying. She lay in bed, thinking for a long time. Then, as the sun was going down, she called Woods closer. "When I am gone, Woods," she said calmly, "take Helen to my sister in Boston. Travel slowly so she does not get too tired. She will not be poor, she has money. But she needs love and care, which my sister will give. If you can stay with her, I will be glad, but my sister will decide. You will find I have remembered you in my will. Please lay me next to my husband, then take Helen away. Everything is arranged. Now, leave me alone with my daughter." Woods left, and Mrs. Ashe opened her arms. Helen lay beside her, quiet like a baby. Helen was a strange girl, both strong and emotional. She loved deeply. She had no brothers, sisters, or close friends. She had loved only her parents. When her father died, she stayed strong to help her mother. Now she was doing the same. Her mother stroked her hair. "My dear, promise me one thing. Don't close your heart. Love your Aunt Helen. She will be your second mother. Her daughter, Laura, is your age. Try to care for them." Helen's heart broke. "Oh, Mama. I will try because you ask me. But how can I? You will never come back." "My darling," her mother whispered, "live a good life for me." She grew weaker. Helen held her tightly as night fell around them. Mrs. Ashe moved a little. Then, with her last bit of strength, she held Helen close and whispered softly, "Goodbye, my darling." After that, she seemed to fall asleep. Helen did not know if she also slept, but after an hour, Woods touched her shoulder. Her voice was kind but firm. "You must get up now, Miss Helen," she said. "She left us so quietly, like a sleeping lamb. Her face looks peaceful and happy." No one knew how painful the next days were for Helen. She kept her sorrow inside, not shedding tears. She turned away from her parents' graves and helped with the journey's plans, acting strangely calm. When she reached her aunt's home in Boston, her cold composure finally broke. Her Aunt Helen looked so much like her mother that, at first, it hurt too much to see her. But when her aunt hugged her gently, almost like her mother would, Helen shivered and suddenly burst into tears. She quickly stopped herself. "I must love you for her sake," she whispered. "She told me to try. But I feel like I left my heart in her grave." Mrs. Mason, as her sister had said, was wise and kind. She did not force Helen to love her or to feel at home. Instead, she was gentle and patient, trying in small ways to make Helen comfortable. Laura Mason, Mrs. Mason's daughter, had been excited to meet Helen. She had always wanted a sister. But Helen's quiet, distant manner disappointed her. Helen kept to herself, as if she had built an invisible wall around her. Summer passed, but they did not grow close. Helen could not stop feeling pain when she saw Laura with her mother, or when Laura ran happily to greet her father. "They have each other," she thought. "I have no one." Even Woods was gone. Mrs. Mason had not kept her. Helen had no one to talk to about her past, so she thought about it even more. Things became easier when school started. Helen and Laura were in the same class, which brought them a little closer. But they were not true friends. In the spring, there would be a big exam, and the best student would win a medal. By winter, it was clear that Helen and Laura were the top students. They became rivals, each wanting to win. One day, Helen overheard Laura ask her mother for a special book that could help her win. Mrs. Mason sighed. "You know the teacher does not allow that. You must study fairly." Helen heard a kiss, and her heart ached. "Laura has a mother," she thought, "but I only have a grave." At least, she would win this contest. She had to. Spring came, and the garden behind the house bloomed, full of birds and flowers. Spring had come. The sun was warm, the flowers bloomed, and the birds sang happily. But Helen and Laura were too busy to enjoy it. They studied all day and night. They even slept with books under their pillows. The big exam week finally arrived. Helen felt ready, except for her French. If only she had the special book, she would be sure to win. At first, she thought, if only it were right to use the book. Then, what if I find it by accident? Then, what if I open my aunt's desk? Finally, she decided, I will get the book. That morning, before anyone woke up, she got out of bed. She moved quietly through the house. Her bare feet made no sound. She held a bunch of old keys from her mother. Maybe one would fit her aunt's desk. Her hands shook as she tried key after key. At last, one worked. She quickly opened the desk and found the book. Her heart pounded. She checked her answers, making small changes. She was so focused that she didn't see someone watching her from the doorway. Then, as quietly as she had come, she went back to bed, her eyes bright with excitement. But Laura had seen everything. She ran to her mother's room, full of shock and anger. "Mamsie, wake up," she whispered. Mrs. Mason sat up, rubbing her eyes. Laura told her everything. She cheated Mamsie. She used the book. And now she will win, unless I tell the teacher. Should I? Mrs. Mason sighed deeply. Oh, my poor sister's child. How could she do this? Laura frowned. But what will we do? Should we stop her? Go back to bed, Mrs. Mason said. Come to me before breakfast. I need to think. Later, when Laura returned, her mother had decided. Listen, dear, she said gently. Winning or losing is not the most important thing. I want to see if Helen will regret what she has done. If she does, there is still hope for her. If not, we will decide what to do next. Laura sighed. So I just let her win unfairly and say nothing? Yes, her mother said. If you're the kind and strong Laura I know you are. Laura groaned. Mamsie, you always know how to convince me. Mrs. Mason smiled. And who always admits, in the end, that I was right? Laura laughed. Not this time, Mamsie. We'll see. The French exam was on the first day. Laura and Helen were the best in the class. Laura did well, but Helen was perfect. Everyone praised her. But instead of feeling happy, Helen felt sick inside. She couldn't even look at Laura. She didn't know Laura had seen her take the book, but she felt guilty anyway. The success she wanted so badly now felt empty. Mrs. Mason watched her closely. On the way home, she whispered to Laura, "Be kind to her. She will suffer tonight." Helen skipped dinner, saying she had a headache. Her aunt sent tea and bread to her room. But Helen could not eat. She lay on her bed, thinking. Almost a year ago, her mother had held her close and said, "Try to live nobly for my sake." Those had been her last words. Now Helen had done something shameful. The sun went down and stars shone through the window. Helen still lay there, fighting a battle inside her heart. She knew she had to fix her mistake, no matter how ashamed she felt. For a moment, she thought about telling her aunt everything. But she was too afraid. She did not sleep much that night. But before morning, she made her decision. I cheated in public. I must confess in public. When she finally fell asleep, she was exhausted. The breakfast bell woke her. That day, she was quiet but calm. She passed her last exams, but she didn't seem to care about the results. Only Mrs. Mason understood why. Finally, it was time to give out the medal. The head teacher stood up. The prize goes to Miss Helen Ash. Before he could finish, Helen stood. Her face was pale, her voice steady. The medal is not mine, she said. I cheated. I took the French book from my aunt's desk. The prize belongs to Laura. The teacher was shocked. Bless my heart, he mumbled. Then, turning to Laura, he said, Miss Laura Mason, you have won this medal fairly. That evening, Mrs. Mason went to Helen's room. My darling, she said softly, her voice full of love. Helen's eyes filled with tears. How can you still care for me after what I did? Mrs. Mason held her close. Because you were brave enough to make it right. And in that moment, Helen knew she had found a new home.